Okay, are we ready? Okay, so I think this is good. So, guys, yesterday I went over the Anglo-Saxon period. So, just to remind you, about 25% of the questions will be from the Anglo-Saxons. So, there's some from the history, and the best way to remind yourself is to look at the little historical timeline on page 5. That's a good way to remember the main facts. Remember, I give extra points for dates. So, if you know at least some of the main dates, like the dates of the era, 449 to 1066, or maybe when Augustine came, or maybe when the Vikings raided, like any date is going to make it a stronger answer. And then there'll always be questions over how the language has changed. So for Old English, it's page 23 and 24, and you need to know the languages that formed to make Old English and why it would not be understandable to us today because of all the Germanic and Latin and Celtic languages. So the medieval period starts on page 25, and it begins in 1066 with this battle. The French cross over and fight Harold, the king of the Saxons, at the Battle of Hastings, and they are successful. So William the Conqueror becomes the king. So now for the next several hundred years, England comes strongly under French influence, has a French king. So the historical chart is on page 27. So whenever I would write like a report from an era, I would just leave the book open to this because it was enough to remind me of the things I wanted to include. So the first dynasty is the Normans from William the Conqueror. And then after that comes the Plantagenets, where we get Henry II, and then Lancaster, and then York. And then the War of Roses ends this era. And a son from one family married the daughter from the other family, and they started a new dynasty, which is called the Tudors. And the Tudors are the dynasty of the Elizabethan age, Henry VI and Elizabeth being the most famous ones. So on page 27, it talks a little bit about feudalism. So that's a question I would probably ask you to define. So that's the agricultural system where a lord of a fief or farm would receive payment for land by military service. And there would be, it's kind of like sharecroppers, people who live on his land who are farmers, and they pay him part of their income from their crops. And the system gradually declined, partially because of the bubonic plague. In 1348, this horrible plague swept through England, killed about a third of the people. Like, it makes coronavirus seem like a sneeze. I mean, this was a deadly disease. This was a horrible disease. You know, people seldom recovered from it. It's not like this virus. You know, this is a real plague. And because so many people died, a lot of these fiefs were just abandoned. You need to know about the Crusades. So the Crusades were when the Pope called for Christian knights to go to the Holy Land to try to defeat the Muslims. And this is, you know, the Christians and Muslims were fighting way back in, 1096, just like the terrorist attacks and conflicts and the killing of leaders today. It's still going on. It's hard to believe. It's a time of chivalry. You will need to know the word chivalry. So chivalry is the code of behavior for knights. It's an ideal code. It's not the way they really acted. But the stories that came out of chivalry, they started a new kind of literature called romance literature. And you need to understand that. Romance literature is not romantic literature. It's literature about knights. In 1170, the king went into a drunken rage and said to his group of barons, "I wish someone would deliver me from this priest that I exalted, the Archbishop of Canterbury. You know, he used to be my best friend, and now he's become all independent and putting God before me, and I feel betrayed. And, you know, he just got very furious because of a political disagreement they'd had. So these barons went to the cathedral in Canterbury and murdered him. And it's important for lots of reasons, but he is the patron saint of England. Thomas Becket is England's patron saint. And his shrine at the cathedral is where the Canterbury characters were walking when they wrote the Canterbury Tales, or when Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales. So it is like the Basilica of Guadalupe in Mexico City in terms of a national monument that unites the Catholics of the nation. It's a very, very important event. This is the time that Gothic cathedrals were being built. In 1215 is when John signed the Magna Carta, and it's important because it's considered the foundation stone of American democracy. It's the first time a king said, okay, I'll let people under me have some voice. You know, they can require certain things, they can request exemption from taxes, they can, you know, make cases. So it's just the beginning of people getting rights. The parliament was formed during this time. A lot of wars with Scotland, 100-year war between England and France. Yeah, so just, you know, kind of look through that chart and kind of understand what's going on during that age. There will be maybe 3 or 4 questions about the history. And then on page 35 is ballads. So you should know what a ballad is. It's a story song, and the themes are usually about love and revenge and people's personal lives, but some of them are historical. We read 2 of the ballads, Bonnie Allen, about the girl who died after she insulted her boyfriend, and out of their graves came the rose and the wild rose and tied a knot, and get up and bar the door. That's about the old couple fighting about who's going to close the door, and the 2 criminals coming in and kissing the wife and shaving the man and causing all this trouble, and they have a fight. So that's pretty typical humor. Page 40 is about Chaucer, and you should know that Chaucer is the 2nd most famous writer in the English language, second only to William Shakespeare. He's called the father of English literature. And his biography is interesting. Most of the writers in England were also political people. They also had political positions. He wrote the Canterbury characters using a technique called a frame story. And a frame story is when you tell a story and inside that story are other ones. So he gives the frame story of this group of pilgrims walking to Canterbury, and then each of them tells a short story. So the pilgrimage is the frame of it. So I will ask you to describe at least 1 or 2 of the characters. I might say, describe the knight, or I might say, describe your favorite character. But you should just look over your notes. You know, I want you to notice too, it says that the characters that are described come from all the different groups of people. They're like the businessmen, there's the religious group, there's manual laborers like the plowmen, and some of them are good and some of them are bad, but they are stereotypes. So the word stereotype means a type of person. And stereotypes have become very powerful again. I would say 50 years ago, people didn't talk about stereotypes much. But now there's a lot of talk about stereotypes, especially in American politics. Like, you know, whether you support Trump, you know, and you're a Trumper, or whether you're lefty and you're a socialist. Everyone's calling everyone's names according to their political position. So it's becoming stronger. Society kind of goes in and out of categorizing people like that. The story we read from the Canterbury characters is The Pardoner's Tale, and I will probably ask you at least 1 or 2 questions. My typical question is, what is the theme of it? And the theme of it is the love for money is a root of all sorts of evil, a Bible verse from Timothy. And I might ask you how the story is ironic. And it's ironic that the partner is trying to get money by telling a story about greed. He's trying to shame his audience into giving a donation. So that's a form of irony. Page 69 is a section on Malory. And Thomas Malory wrote the King Arthur legends into a book called Morte d'Arthur while he was in jail. And I will ask you something about King Arthur. You know, you need to know that his kingdom, called Camelot, is a utopian or an ideal kingdom. And it is based on humility. It's based on the Bible story. You know, he is a humble king, and he wants to show the nation that power doesn't have to be abusive, that you could be right-hearted and still have great might. But the kingdom collapses because of adultery between his wife, Guinevere, and one of his knights, and then his illegitimate son, Mordred, yes, leads a rebellion. So I'm, you know, and I might ask you what modern story is based on it. Of course, it's not modern to you, but the Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi and Han Solo and, you know, the people from Star Wars are an exact parallel to the Arthurian legend. So it's kind of neat. When you really get to know the Bible, you know, it's part of who you are. You've read it a lot. And then you get to know some of the classical literature. You will find you'll just be watching some show on TV or even some series on Netflix. You'll think, oh my goodness, this character is a takeoff on Macbeth. Or, wow, she's modeled after Lady Macbeth. Or, oh my goodness, this scene is like the murder of Hamlet's father. Or, you know, you'll start seeing how there are certain themes that are repeated and repeated. So it's really kind of fun to see different ways a story of redemption or betrayal or anything else is presented again. Do you know what the name of King Arthur's sword is? Excalibur. Good, good. Yeah, I may throw in some of those little one-pointers or bonus ones too. Okay, page 75 is Middle English. So you need to know that to become Middle English, the language gradually evolved under the influence of French. So I think I've read this too several times, but it went from that real guttural sounding shoulder, you know, stuff of Beowulf to the French influence of Vanin Albriel with the Chèvre Salta, the Rata Marta Pertha to the Rota, that sort of softer sound of the Canterbury Tales. So what? No, it's actually Middle English. I wish I could speak Russian, then I could show off to my son.
Ivan Ivanovich Ivanov.
Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky.
Yes.
Yeah, I know a couple authors' names. Okay, so page 77 is the beginning of the Elizabethan age. So 1485 is when the Tudor dynasty started. It's when peace came after the War of Roses, and the two warring houses, Lancaster and York, made a treaty. Elizabethan English is considered the most eloquent level of the English language. The vocabulary was very, very rich. They used a lot of words borrowed from other languages. The language of Shakespeare has more descriptive words than we even have now about some things. The most important thing that happened during this age was probably the defeat of the Spanish Armada. 1588 is considered a pivotal year in world history. So I'm going to ask kind of an essay question about that. So let me tell you what I think is most important. So the King of Spain was married to Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, but they were unable to have a child. So Mary wanted to take England back to Catholicism. Okay, but she died before she was able to. So her half sister, Elizabeth, at age 25, became queen. And under Elizabeth, relationships with Spain got worse. You know, she didn't want England to become Catholic again. She was a Protestant. She allowed her pirates to attack Spain. So Spain was stealing wealth from Mexico. This is when the conquistadors were coming and ripping off Mexico. And then they would come back. And as soon as they got near Spain, the pirates from England would go out and take the gold that they had stolen. And the King of Spain, Philip, said, you know, Elizabeth, you need to stop this. This is unacceptable. We do all the work and then you steal it from us. So the King of Spain told the Queen of England to arrest her pirates. And instead, she went on board the ships and she knighted them. She honored them. So Sir Francis Drake was one of her pirates who she knighted. It's really kind of a fun story. And then she had the Queen of Scotland under house arrest in England, and that the Queen of Scotland is Catholic, and she executed her. She beheaded Mary, Queen of Scots. So all of these issues were just building up this conflict between Catholic Spain and Protestant England. So after 20 years of this increased anger, Philip decided to attack Elizabeth and make her repent and humble her and bring her back to Catholicism. So he sent his fleet, which was over 300 galleons, huge, you know, sailing ships. And Elizabeth didn't have much of a navy. Hers was very small, mostly merchant marines. So, no, did you need something else? Yeah, thank you. So, I don't think I showed you the speech, but if you ever get a chance, just Google, you know, Queen Elizabeth's speech during the Spanish Armada. It's kind of like the Gettysburg Address. It's one of those famous speeches she makes. You know, she goes out in armor in front of her army and she says, I am just a woman, but I have the heart of a lion and I will never allow my country to be overcome and we will persevere. It's like something Churchill would say. It's just beautiful, beautiful writing and speaking. And I've seen it in every movie that they've ever made. It's just, I love the scene. So it looks like England will be defeated, but a storm comes out of the North Sea and it blows the ships of Spain into confusion. And then the English start these little boats they have, these old boats on fire, and pushes them into the Spanish galleons. And a lot of them start burning. So the Spanish navy's in disarray and it starts sailing around the outside of Scotland and Ireland and Wales, you know, the Great Britain. And another storm blows it off in the Atlantic and most of them die. You know, most of the ships sink. So Elizabeth took it as a sign that God favored Protestantism and favored the English. And the Spanish, you know, they were in despair, you know, because they were called the mistress of the seas. They had the greatest navy in the world. They were like the Roman Empire, you know. And then England, the power shifted. So why is it important? And I've told you this before, but I just think it's really cool. If this storm had not come, if this battle had not turned, the United States would not have been established by English-speaking Protestants. It would have been established by Catholic Spanish speakers. So Mexico would actually have gone all the way up to Canada. Now, most of you think that would have been a good thing, you know, and there's an argument to be made for it. But if you believe God has destinies for nations, which I do, I believe there's a destiny over Mexico. I believe there's a destiny over French Canada. And I think there's a destiny over the United States. I think God has purpose. He has giftings in different nations to bring good to the world. And, you know, I believe that. So this was the most significant historical event that led to the colonization of United States, Jamestown and Plymouth and all of that. So it's important. Okay, so Edmund Spenser, called the Poet's Poet, wrote a series of poems about Queen Elizabeth, longest series of sonnets ever written, ended up as an ambassador in Ireland. Very difficult, but also a beautiful writer. On page 89, it talks about sonnets. I will ask you a question like what makes a poem a sonnet? So you need to know it's 14 lines. You need to know it's an iambic pentameter. Every other line is stressed. And you need to know there's three main rhyme schemes. There's the Italian, the Spenserian, and the Elizabethan. And that's all on page 89. Walter Raleigh and Christopher Marlowe's on page 91. And I might ask you about the different opinions expressed in the two pastorals, which are on page 92. So a pastoral is a poem about shepherds, people who live in the country. At this time, as the court became more fancy, more perfume and wigs and silk and men in stockings and sissified guys, and as it got more fancy, there was this shift of opinion about people who lived more naturally, and they were kind of a marvel to these upper class court people. Thought, wow, they wear comfortable clothes. Wow, they go barefoot sometimes. You know, like it was just this shift. So some of the poems idolized the more natural life. I don't think I asked you about Sidney, Michael Drayton. I don't think I asked you Champion. Okay, so then we get into Shakespeare. And of course, I'll ask you about Shakespeare, why he's so famous. On the bottom of page 100 is a little summary of his accomplishments. The last sentence says he wrote 2 long narratives, 154 sonnets, 2 long poems, 37 plays, comedies, histories, tragedies, and farces. Most famous English writer who's ever lived. I will ask you a couple questions about Macbeth, probably ones that have been on other quizzes. Who's to blame? Is it really a tragedy? What makes a play a tragedy? Do you experience catharsis when he dies? You know, just those things that you should now understand. And then I'm going to throw in a page of questions about Hamlet. So if you read Hamlet, I'm going to ask you, did you watch any version of it? If so, which one, or read it? And then I'm going to, so you'll get credit for that, because I said I'd give you credit for that. Then I'll ask you a question, and there'll be a page of Hamlet questions, which I'll grade up here. If you didn't, it will just cost you a couple points, but it'll help you. Same with Lady Jane. Lady Jane's story is so cool. And how many of you watched the movie Lady Jane? Just a couple of you. There is a scene in it, and I know I'm a spoiler, but tough luck. If you haven't watched it yet, too bad for you. There's a scene in it, too. Me is one of the most beautiful scenes I've ever seen in a movie. And it's when they're married and they have slept together. And she thinks he was immoral before they got married. He says, oh yeah, I spent a lot of time in houses of prostitution. So she's like, she's like really disappointed. And then after they spend the night together, he says that was the first time he'd been with a woman. And she starts crying. And he says, why are you crying? And this scene, of course, she's an amazing actress. This woman is off the chart amazing. But she says, don't you know? It's because I was your first too. You know, and there is something so pure and so innocent about that scene that I almost can't describe it, because it's just better than any lecture you could ever hear in church about the value of sexual morality. Is this like the sweetness of the fact that, you know, neither of them had any baggage, you know, neither of them had things they were ashamed of. It's a beautiful scene. If you watch nothing else, find it on YouTube. It's just beautiful.
And of 1,000 Days Sexy.
And 1,000 Days what?
Is that what we look up?
Okay, so Shakespeare, of course, probably 3 or 4 questions. Ben Jonson, page 183. And what you should know about him is that he was William Shakespeare's for a while considered a better playwright than Shakespeare. So manual laborer, he was a brick builder. I think they call it carrying hod when he carries cement and stuff. And he wrote 3 different types of thing. On page 185, it's this beautiful memory he has of William Shakespeare. He just almost deifies him, says he was just astonishing. He wrote like the gods, just kind of worships him. And then on page 187, he wrote this other thing that kind of made fun of him because he never improved any of his stuff, never edited it. And then on page 185 are the 2 poems about his boy, Benjamin, who died at age 7. And I will ask you at least 1 question from each poem. So the one on the noble nature is the one where he says, is a 300-year-old tree really more precious than a flower? Good question. And his response is, I don't think so. Life is life. And even if it's just a little forest flower that opens one day, is it really less than? He says, my son was like that. His life was short, but it was amazing. And then the other one, he says, I'm standing by my son's grave, and I should be happy for him because he never really suffered. He just got to be a kid. He never had to be an old man. He never had to get sick. He never had rejection in his life. He just got to be a kid and then go to heaven. It was during a plague. It was a time of illness. Yeah, there was a 1603 one. There was the 1438 one, the 1603, and then there was a really bad one in 1665, which was just before the Great Fire of London. So London got hit by a plague, and then the city burned down. We think we have problems. It was horrible. Yeah, so he says at the very end, he says, if only I could lose my father's heart. And he says, if I could only get rid of this passion I have to love my son. And then he says, I make a vow that I will never again like or care about anything so much again. So he sort of curses all future children to be rejected by their dad. Very sad. Page 188 is Francis Bacon. What you should know about him is that he developed the scientific method, which is the kind of logic that uses inductive thinking. And that he was the father of the English essay. He's the one who developed it. Other cultures, like the Greeks, had essays. It's not like he's the only one who ever wrote a short report on something, but he's like the foundation of this style. And the essay we read is called Of Wisdom for Man's Self. And I will probably ask you something he says in the essay about selfishness. Okay, so remember he says it's kind of like an animal leaving a house before it falls down, or someone who thinks, I'm going to burn your house so I can get a fire to cook my eggs. He says, if you're selfish and you're the king, it's not so bad, but if you're selfish and you're supposed to be helping someone in power and authority and responsibility, then you can do a lot of damage for your little bit of good. So it's just about the damage a selfish person can do. Yes. Yes. Page 191 is a King James Bible. So again, this is one of the things you could have facts about. You could say King James had the Bible translated by 54 scholars. It was presented in 1611, and it became the authorized version. It took over the position of authority of all the other Bibles, the Great Bible, the Tyndale Bible, the other Bibles that have been translated. And it's still considered one of the greatest accomplishments, a classic written by a committee, they say. And then on page 192 It talks about some of the qualities that they kept in it, such as repetition, parallelism, comparison, imagery. And as I said before, they didn't create these things. They just were able to bring them from the Hebrew. These are in the original and much more. People who read Hebrew say no translation compares to the Hebrew of the Psalms. They say it's just amazing poetry. So King James tried to keep some of that poetry. Okay, and then we end with the last stage of English called Modern English during the Elizabethan Age. And that's page 193 and 194. And by then, pronunciation is simplified, spelling is standardized, the E's at the end of words are dropped, just streamlining it. And a modern person could understand the words if they were transported to the Globe Theater in 1600, you could understand it. If you tried to watch Hamlet, which some of you did, you realize it wouldn't be easy to understand, but you could follow most of it. Okay.
Why do we have to know about Francis Bacon?
Okay, what I would